Hello everyone. In today's lecture we will be examining the soldiers from all over the globe who fought for European armies in the First World War. All of the major combatants in the war, even the Italians, were in possession of a sizable multi-ethnic empire, and they used these empires to extract as much manpower as possible. Britain's richest, most populous colony was India, and the British made extensive use of Indian soldiers to fight the war. Over 1 million Indian infantrymen, known colloquially as Sepoys, took part in the First World War. The Indian Army was technically separate from the British Army as a whole. It was a volunteer army, containing Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, but heavily skewed towards the latter two groups. The British considered the Sikhs, who made up just 1% of India's population, but 22% of the army, as a martial race, whose fighting ability was unmatched by their Hindu neighbours. The officers of the Indian Army were overwhelmingly white, and the commanders were entirely white. The Indian Army was divided into 7 different segments, who each fought in a different theatre of what was from the start a global war. Force A was sent to France, where soldiers suffered from the usual tribulations of trench warfare, as well as dealing with an unusual climate. Forces B and C were sent to East Africa, defeating a German force in today's Tanzania. Force D fought in Iraq, suffering devastating losses from disease. Forces E and F were vital in the British victory in Palestine, whilst Force G suffered extensive losses during the invasion of Gallipoli. Overall, 74,000 Indians lost their lives fighting to defend the very empire that repressed them. The British raised men and money from India, as well as large supplies of food, cash and ammunition, collected by British taxes and from the autonomous princes of the subcontinent. In return, the British promised to deliver self-rule to India at the end of the war. This commitment was, however, a lie. In Singapore in 1915, half a regiment of sepoys mutinied rather than be sent to the front. The rebellious soldiers killed a number of Europeans in Singapore before their rebellion was brutally crushed and their leaders executed. Despite German and Ottoman attempts to spread dissent among other Muslim troops in the Indian Army, no other major mutiny occurred. Many subjects of the so-called White Dominions of the British Empire enlisted as volunteers in the war. Canadians developed such a frightening reputation among their German opponents that some Germans wondered whether Canadian might be code for an elite British commando unit. Canadian soldiers were the first to be targeted by gas attacks and distinguished themselves by capturing Vimy Ridge, part of which was given by the French government to Canada in thanks after the war. Canadian industry exploded in demand as the country became the most important supplier of Allied ammunition outside of Europe. Meanwhile, the conscription of French Canadians into the armed forces caused mass discontent. Perhaps because of their bravery, Canadian casualties were higher. Out of approximately 625,000 Canadians who served, about 60,000 were killed in action or died in active service, and another 173,000 were wounded. By the end of the war, Canadian separatism and national identity had been greatly strengthened. A similar story could be followed in Australia and New Zealand, whose forces were collectively known as Anzac. The most famous engagement of Anzac was in the Gallipoli campaign. The day of landing at Gallipoli, April 25th, became a day of national reverence in Australia. Australian troops also occupied German New Guinea and fought in France. Ypres, Amiens, and Amiens saw high Anzac casualties. In Palestine, the Australian Light Horse and Cavalry Corps was vital in keeping the Desert War mobile and in the encirclement of the Ottoman forces. Successive referendums to introduce conscription to Australia failed as the government pushed the colony to do more and more for the war effort. Whilst the war brought national pride and an economic boost to both Australia and New Zealand, this came at a horrific cost. Nearly a third of every New Zealand man between the ages 20 and 40 was either killed or wounded. Voices in Canada, Australia and New Zealand all called for greater autonomy within the British Empire, whilst remaining mostly conservative and loyal to the King. Britain, France, Germany and Italy also all raised forces in Africa. The French made the most extensive use of African troops with the so-called Senegalese sharpshooters. Over the course of the war, 200,000 West Africans fought for France, helping to make up for massive French losses during the conflict. Despite suffering horribly in the trenches, the sharpshooters' morale remained high. To help them acclimatise to the French conditions, African troops were allowed leave in southern France every winter during the war. The sharpshooters served with distinction in the Gallipoli campaign, during which the French briefly took the ancient city of Troy, and in the invasion of revolutionary Russia in 1918. In return for their service, the African elite in Senegal was granted full French citizenship rights. The German Empire made use of local African soldiers in its defensive campaigns in East Africa, Namibia and Cameroon. This colonial army was termed the Schutztruppe or Protection Force, and it developed a fantastic reputation for guerrilla combat. Whilst unable to take to the offensive against the British in East Africa, the Protection Force conducted hit-and-run raids from the Tanzanian highlands, living off of the land and never staying long in the same place. This way, the Germans were able to tie down thousands of British soldiers, preventing them from joining the fight in Europe and costing the Empire money. After Portugal declared war on Germany, the Protection Force moved into Portuguese Mozambique and continued the war there, living off of remote Portuguese estates and causing widespread destruction. To fight the Germans, the British made use of their own African soldiers, organised into the so-called King's African Rifles, mostly made up of soldiers from Tanzania, Uganda and Somalia. White settlers in Kenya were very reluctant to train Africans in the use of weapons, in fear that these weapons would subsequently be used against them. In the end, the King's African Rifles stood at about 30,000 African soldiers and 2,500 white officers. About a third of this force would die in the war to enemy action or disease. As well as this, hundreds of thousands of Africans were employed on pitiful wages as porters, carrying supplies into the East African interior. Many porters died in the brutal conditions. The Ottoman army continued to contain a number of Kurds and even Armenians in its ranks. 60,000 Armenians were conscripted into the Ottoman army. They joined the ranks of Armenians already in the army service. Despite the harsh conditions awaiting them, Armenians served bravely, even being mentioned by Enver Pasha early in the war in dispatches. The Russian army, facing the Ottomans on the Caucasus front, was formed not only of Russians, but Armenians, Georgians, and Central Asians. It was the presence of Armenian volunteers in the Russian ranks that helped to create the atmosphere of conspiracy behind the Ottoman front lines that directly led to the events of the Armenian genocide. The Austro-Hungarian army was one of the empire's few unified institutions, with Hungarians, Germans, and Slavs all serving side by side in mixed units. The Hungarians supported the war, spurred on by poor relations with the Russians, who promoted themselves as protectors of the Hungarians' Slavic subjects. Hungarians would have much to lose in the event of an Allied victory, as was subsequently proven in the post-war Treaty of Trianon. Hungary's submergence into the long, devastating war included the mobilization of nearly 4 million men, the death of 650,000, and the exhaustion of the Hungarian economy. Agricultural output declined by half during the last years of the war, and the currency lost more than half of its value. In the autumn of 1918, Hungary was on the brink of economic collapse. Voices raised calling for outright independence, a rejection of the alliance with Germany, and a separate Hungarian peace with the Allies. This, it was felt, would protect and preserve Hungary from its subject peoples. Slavs played an important role in the Austro-Hungarian army, as we shall see during our reading of the good soldier Schweik, which follows the travails of an unfortunate Czech. Slavic soldiers fought well against the Italians, especially Slovenian and Croatian soldiers, who feared Italian expansion at their expense in Istria and Dalmatia. However, Czechs and Slovaks in particular were less effective when fighting the Russian Empire. The Russians formed a Czech brigade entirely from Czech prisoners of war and sent it back to fight against the Austro-Hungarians, where it distinguished itself with its bravery. Among the Czechs, the war was unpopular because they realized that a German victory would terminate their hopes for political autonomy. Polish independence hero Józef Piłsudski commanded a brigade of Poles that fought for the Austro-Hungarians. His cooperation with Austria and Germany was tactical, and Piłsudski always strove to bring about complete independence, waiting for the right moment. In 1915, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians drove out the Russians from Poland, and on November 5, 1916, they issued the Two Emperors Manifesto proclaiming the creation of a Polish kingdom. Its status and borders remained undefined, but the document resuscitated the Polish question. Piłsudski, who refused to raise Polish troops without a more certain political commitment, came into conflict with the German authorities, and in 1917 was imprisoned in Magdeburg, Germany. Some Poles also fought on the side of the Allies, but the Russian Tsar promised reforms with far more hesitation than the Germans had done. With the entry of the United States into the war in 1917, Black Americans enlisted in the military in large numbers, with over 700,000 African Americans registering for military service by July of that year. However, the U.S. Army was segregated, and Black Americans were barred from the Marine Corps and from flying aeroplanes. Black officers were trained in separate segregated camps from white officers, to great public outcry. The Black and Puerto Rican Harlem Hellfighters Regiment, nicknamed by their German enemy, spent more time in the trenches and lost more men than any other American regiment during the war. Upon their return home, many Black veterans faced indifference or hostility to their role in the war, and some were attacked while still wearing their uniforms. The overall aim of this lecture has been to show how complex the armies fighting the First World War were. Whereas we tend to think of the French or the Russians as being unified entities, in reality they were complex and multifaceted empires populated by a variety of different individuals, for whom the war and their nation all meant different things. Even the German forces, overwhelmingly white and German-speaking, were divided by religious lines and state affiliation. The Bavarians, for example, had their own military structure, with a good deal of autonomy from the Prussian General Staff. Unfortunately, instead of promoting greater understanding, the role of different men fighting side by side was covered up or ignored after the war, and national myths of homogeneous white armies took their place.